The question is that these bills now be read a second time. Before I call the acting leader of the opposition in the Legislative Assembly, I remind all members to extend the usual courtesy to the acting leader for the budget reply speech to be delivered uninterrupted. I call the acting leader of the opposition.
Thank you, Mr Acting Speaker, and I acknowledge my family and staff and friends from the Illawarra who have come up. Thank you very, very much. Yes, those proud men and women from the trade union movement. Thank you, and of course a special thanks to my 9-year-old boy Preston. The reason I'm not in the leadership race. Debt, deceitful, disappointing. 3 words that could easily describe this budget. Since coming to office 8 long years ago, this government has received $61 billion in stamp duty through a property boom, the likes of which we've never seen before. $70 billion has gone from selling community assets. All this, and they made the election promise that we could have it all. Yet 48 hours ago, this government delivered the largest debt in the history of our state. Thousands of jobs cut, increased taxes, and broken promises. Mr Speaker, the Treasurer talks of small government, so he saddles the state with debt, sells off our public assets, and undermines our future prosperity. We care about the economic future of this state because it supports opportunity, care, and a safety net for each of us and the communities we are so grateful to represent. It's important. It's important for the family in Auburn, an area with one of the highest rates of homelessness in New South Wales, who face moving from one crisis accommodation to the next. It's important for the parents in Penrith who want their children to receive an education that prepares them for the future. It's important for the elderly residents in Newcastle who, as the temperature drops, are struggling to stay warm because of soaring electricity bills. And Mr Speaker, it's also important for the young person living in Coffs Harbour who, despite their best efforts, are unable to find work because 1 in every 5 young people in that area are unemployed. Mr Speaker, importantly, let's not forget those families who are doing it tough on the land in this terrible drought. Everyone knows the significant impact the drought has had on rural and regional New South Wales. As we sit here, there are communities just weeks away from having no water. Mr Speaker, we are concerned about the impact on the towns, but also the cost to local jobs, and there needs to be urgent measures put in place for these communities. Mr Speaker, the effect and impact that the drought has had on farmers, workers, small businesses and families can never be underestimated. Premier, I implore you to not apply the efficiency dividends for any agency delivering services to drought-affected communities and farmers. Mr Speaker, I say this to the farmers across New South Wales. The Labor Party knows you are doing it tough, and my colleagues and I stand with you. This government will have our support for any drought relief. A state stricken by drought needs a unified parliament, and we will ensure that it has. Mr Speaker, in 2011, the government inherited $6 billion of debt, just 1.4% of the gross state product. But somehow this government has sold now $70 billion worth of public assets during a record housing boom, and it's going to take us into $39 billion of debt. In 4 years' time, we will have the largest debt in the history of New South Wales. Debt, as a share of the economy, will be the highest since the turn of the century, more than 5%. And Mr. Speaker, worse still, no plan to pay it back. The interest alone on that debt will be more than we spend employing the entire New South Wales police force. And it only gets worse. We know now the revenue-generating assets are long gone. They're delivering profits to their private shareholders. And stamp duty is falling. Mr. Speaker, the economy is weakening. Growth in state final demand will fall from 3.4% to 2.5%. Wages growth remains at record low levels. Jobs growth is forecast to fall to just 1.25%. So in 4 years' time, with the largest debt in history, it will only be harder to pay it back. Mr. Speaker, when the dust settles on this government, its legacy will be clear. After 8 years, this O'Farrell, Baird, Berejiklian government will be remembered as the most wasteful in this state's history. Consider the facts. The government has sold $70 billion worth of your assets. Assets that belong to the people of New South Wales. It's our electricity network. It's our desalination plant. But it's worse. It's even the Land Titles Office. That's the agency that holds the deeds to your home. Mr. Speaker, they've taken these revenue-producing assets and flogged them off in the biggest fire sale this country has ever witnessed. Once sold, we know that these assets are gone forever. But more importantly, so too are the revenue streams. Revenue streams that the state relied on into the future. This is why we will reach record debt. It was a choice. And because of that choice, dividends that once generated $2.6 billion in income for this state are now falling to $779 million. Because of privatisation, revenue keeps falling and debt keeps rising. And what has happened to that $70 billion so far, Mr. Speaker? Well, $14 billion has been lost to budget blowouts on major projects alone. Just a fraction of that money could have been spent to help people like Rosemary Hoy. Rosemary's a Macquarie Fields resident who cannot access her local train station. She uses a wheelchair after a multiple sclerosis diagnosis. But there are no lifts at Macquarie Fields train station. To get a train, she must first travel to Ingleburn. Only under this Liberal government does someone in southwest Sydney have to travel backwards to go forwards. Mr. Speaker, when the government privatised our electricity network, the people thought and were told they were funding infrastructure, not infrastructure blowouts. Mr. Speaker, they just keep coming. I'm talking about a project so mismanaged that the contractor it hired to build that infamous light rail just down the road has sued the Berejiklian government for deceptive and misleading conduct. Mr. Speaker, that's a serious accusation. But it's okay, because the Premier assured us, and continued to do so during the election, that the accusation was completely unjustified. But just days after the election, Mr. Speaker, she decided to pay $576 million to the contractors to settle. $576 million. Now, I don't know about you, Mr Speaker, but if I'm wrongly accused of deceptive and misleading conduct, I wouldn't be handing over more than $500 million to settle. So either, Mr Speaker, they're handing over $576 million of the community's money that it doesn't have to, or maybe they did engage in deceptive and misleading conduct, because it certainly wouldn't be the first time. This is the Premier who told us, remember, the light rail first increased in cost because of customer improvements. But it took the state's Auditor-General to say something else months later. They gave us the real reason for the blowout: poor planning, mispricing and omissions in the business case. Mr Speaker, let's break that down. $517 million because of poor planning. $576 million to settle court action for deceptive and misleading conduct. Mr Speaker, that's $1.1 billion of taxpayer money wasted on this Premier's incompetence. Imagine how many more classrooms across Western Sydney could be air-conditioned. How many stations like Unanderra could have lifts installed. Mr Speaker, the government has broken faith with the people of New South Wales, but particularly for me from regional New South Wales, it's broken their faith. The much-famed $250 regional seniors travel card. We all remember it. The problem is it's only funded for 2 years. The budget delivers just 1/3 of the promised $1 billion upgrade to the Princes Highway. And for our people out west, it's worse. Just 10% of the $2.5 billion promised for the Great Western Highway has been allocated. Mr Speaker, and the $266 million for the Muswellbrook bypass? Well, only $11 million over the next 4 years has been allocated. But it's nothing new. Regional New South Wales has been given just half of the infrastructure spending they were promised. Cheated out of $1.2 billion in infrastructure. All this during a drought. No wonder the people of regional and rural New South Wales are angry, particularly angry at the National Party. In March this year, those opposites announced a road package of more than $20 billion. But they included only 2.5% of that. When they underinvest in our roads, real people suffer. People like Dominic from Epping, who has to travel 45 minutes to work every day. And with 5 children and a 6th on the way,
Order, members.
time in the car means time away from the family. This election...
Order, members.
This election saw new highs, or lows, when it came to empty promises and spin. Remember when the Premier promised 4,600 new teachers? The price tag was supposedly $2 billion. But beware of the fine print. The Premier did not allocate a single cent of new money for teachers. Just ask the Independent Parliamentary Budget Office. And as for the proposed school builds and upgrades, well, more than 60% of those don't even have a start date, let alone a completion date. The schools listed as in the planning phase were also in the planning phase last year. And of the 9 schools in last year's budget, 9 new schools, they've all been re-announced this year. Mr Speaker, in health, the government has made big claims about health funding. They haven't even honoured their election promises. There is no money, nor even a single mention in the budget of a new hospital in the Foster-Tuncurry area, promised by the local member in March. There is no new money to build the new Rouse Hill Hospital, promised by Mike Baird in 2015, and again by the Premier in 2019. And Mr Speaker, promised upgrades to Bankstown Hospital, RPA, Sydney Children's Hospital, Ryde Hospital, Fairfield Hospital, Shoalhaven Hospital, St George Hospital, Eurobodalla and Manning Base hospitals also aren't funded in this budget. Mr Speaker, on March this year, just days before people went to vote, the Premier gave an ironclad guarantee. She was asked, will you sell any further assets? Sydney Water, the rest of the electricity network, and she gave a firm no. Not only that, but the Premier gave an ironclad guarantee to the people of New South Wales. That, and I quote, if we were, we would have told you up front. That was before the election. Mr Speaker, after, her Treasurer now refuses to rule out privatisation. Her Transport Minister refuses to rule out privatisation. And then on Tuesday, just hours after handing down her debt bomb budget, she refuses to rule out privatisation. Because, Mr Speaker, it's in their blood. It's what they believe in. Mr Speaker, it's the Fire and Emergency Services Levy that was described by this Treasurer as the most significant reform in a generation that takes the cake. He introduced legislation. He spent $25 million implementing the new tax. He even established an Office of the Insurance Monitor, all of which made the humiliation worse when he backed down. But we thought that was the end of it. But no. Why bother introducing a new tax when you can just raise an old one? Despite his refrain of no new taxes, this budget confirms they've raised taxes by $603 million through the Emergency Services Levy. A $600 million insurance tax that hits every single person in New South Wales. The average insurance bill will rise by around $100. But concerningly, 11,000 households, right across the communities that we're so fortunate to represent, will now drop their insurance coverage completely due to yet another cost of living hit. But it won't just hit people with insurance. Every person in this state will pay through their council rates. The people of Wagga Wagga, they'll pay $156,000 more. Cumberland Council, well, they'll pay an extra $410,000. The people of Singleton, that community will be hit with a $128,000 bill. And the good folks of Wollongong will have to pay $213,000. When you take hundreds of thousands of dollars from these communities, we know you leave potholes in the roads. You take playgrounds and sports fields from children, and you push up council rates for every household in this state. This is economic reform under the Liberals and Nationals. Before the election, this government talked a big game when it came to jobs, but they deliver cuts, like cuts to disability advocacy services, an area that should be off limits, and an area that will be supported by Labor. Those advocates have been arguing for $20 million in advocacy funding. Labor will support it. Labor is committed to it. Under the Liberal and Nationals cuts, the vulnerable people are now more vulnerable. Before the election, there was no mention of more than 2,500 job cuts to the public sector. But it took the Premier just days to revert to type. These are jobs in roads, public transport, and they are people working tirelessly for our state, day in, day out. And mark my words, regional New South Wales will suffer bitterly. The last round of Liberal and Nationals job cuts hit 15,000 people, thousands of them in our regions. That's thousands of people, families in our country towns cast to the scrap heap. Premier, what will happen to the men and women working for the Firearms Registry, the Department of Crown Lands, State Debt Recovery Office, or the Department of Primary Industries? Cuts are cuts, and they will hurt communities everywhere. But not even our emergency services are safe. Does anyone remember before the election the Premier saying she would rip $77 million out of the New South Wales Rural Fire Service? No. But she's done it anyway. Does anyone remember the Premier saying she would slash the Fire and Rescue New South Wales funding by $41 million? No. But they've done it anyway. Thousands of people are about to lose jobs and lose their income. Thousands of people who don't know how they'll pay their mortgage, their rent, or put food on the table. Mr. Speaker, I want to talk about two issues not addressed by the Treasurer on Tuesday. The first is climate change. The Treasurer's speech made no mention of climate change. But why would he? After all, this is the Treasurer who said, if you question man-made climate change, you are not a sceptic. Yes, you are. This state has suffered a lost decade to address climate change. And under this Treasurer, that will continue. For him, climate change is a gratuitous waste of public money. On this side of the House, we accept climate change is real because we believe in science. We know that we as a state must invest in renewable energy. My colleagues and I, just like at the last election, will never apologise for putting forward bold policy in this area. Mr. Speaker, the second issue is one very close to my heart, and it's the issue of homelessness. Last week our country fared well one of its finest, Bob Hawke. One of his quotes was this. Bob said, "The things which are most important don't always scream the loudest." How easily this could apply to the challenge of homelessness. Every night across the communities we represent, the communities that we live in, and the communities that we love, there are around 38,000 of our fellow citizens who are experiencing homelessness in New South Wales. There's been talk of a lot of records in this budget. This is another record, and it's not one to be proud of. These people won't have a warm and safe place to sleep during these cold winter nights. Their stories are not often told in this place. I want to tell a few of them. I met Emma at the Wollongong Homeless Hub. Emma's a young woman who shouldn't be couch surfing. She shouldn't be sleeping in the sand dunes of the local beach until she's so sick she needs urgent medical care. Elderly women shouldn't be using their cars to shelter from the cold. And mothers like Chantel, who I've spoken to, shouldn't be living in motels wondering if the decision to leave their violent partner was the right one. Ahead of this speech, I made the decision that I wanted to lend support and use this opportunity to any measure to reduce homelessness. But there are no new measures to address this issue in the budget. I remember the government's commitment to halve homelessness during the election campaign. I remember how they were unable to even answer how many people are homeless now. Premier, homelessness is up almost 40% on your watch. The Labor Party and every one of my colleagues offer a hand in support, but these people cannot and should not wait 4 years. I ask this: is there an opportunity with 4 years to run in this parliament to make a real difference in addressing what the Salvation Army has called a national crisis? I suggest there is. We understand it means providing more interventional support along the way to try and stop people falling through the cracks. But above all, we understand it takes political will from all sides. Like we have with the drought, Labor stands ready to do what it can to enhance any measures to reduce homelessness in New South Wales. Because on this side, we know these people who live in every one of our communities expect this issue to be above politics. Mr. Speaker, the Labor Party supports an ambitious community and an ambitious society. We have and always will be strong and determined advocates for high-quality public services, particularly in areas of health, education, community support and safety. It's why when the government attempted to privatise hospitals on the floor of the Parliament, we fought alongside the community to oppose it. It's why our nurses and allied health workers who ensure our hospitals function effectively are a priority for the men and women on this side of the chamber. It's why we believe that properly funding early childhood education, school education and TAFE training is an investment, not a cost. It's why we proposed an additional $158 million package to support victims and survivors of domestic, family and sexual violence. And Mr. Speaker, it's why, as I've said, we commit today to delivering those disability advocacy services those people so desperately need and deserve. Mr. Speaker, we have to revisit our agenda for the next 4 years, but our values are enduring and they are not up for review. And adopting a small target strategy is not one of them. Improving the lives of working people and the local communities we represent is at the heart of why we on this side entered this place. But more importantly than any of us, it's what our community rightly expect from each of us. We will never shy away from the big economic, environmental and social challenges that face New South Wales and the people we are so proud and honoured to represent. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals and Nationals have received $61 billion in stamp duty, $70 billion in privatisations, and they promised we could have it all. And they deliver job cuts. They deliver increased taxes and tolls. And worse, they deliver broken promises. It's the Liberal way, and we're calling it out. Over the next 4 years, Labor will continue to scrutinise the government while building an agenda rooted in our values, eternal values. And at the end of that process, there'll be a vote and $39 billion of debt. Thank you.
In accordance with the resolution of 18th of June 2019, I will now put the question. The question is that these bills now be read a second time. All those